exactly happened. Like, I don't know about the rest of you, but I remember I came home from a business trip and, was just easing in and going to bed. And then all of a sudden my phone is blowing up with the stock market's crashing and we're going to have World War III over in the Middle East. And we don't know who the vice presidential pick is going to be. And, oh, by the way, did you hear that a member of Congress said that they're going to disqualify Trump and, bring in the military and go into... I'm thinking, what? Like, I just wanted to go to sleep. I just wanted to go to bed. But we can't. We can't, right? We have to analyze all of this in order to talk about what has been really going on, because there's a lot of explanations flying around on why what's happened with the stock market is happening, why what's going on in the Middle East is happening. Why did Kamala Harris choose Tim Walz, which, by the way, I'm actually happy for, but we'll explain that maybe a little bit later. And what was this quote coming from a sitting member of Congress talking about a potential civil war footing and what he plans to do if Trump actually wins the election in November? We're going to be talking about all of that and more on this episode of Making the Argument Live. As always, I am your host, Nick Freitas, member of the Virginia House of Delegates, but other than that, a fairly good guy. With me in the studio, my beautiful bride, Tina, Queen of the Bees.
Hello, everyone.
And then, of course, we have our resident historian and political prognosticator, Christian Hines. How you doing, Christian?
It's been a while since we've done an econ episode. I'm excited.
Yeah, well, that'll be part of it. It's not going to be all econ. It's not going to be all econ, all right? We're going.
Oh, yeah, the rest is World War III.
World War III. Well, look, to kind of like set everything off here, I mean, what does Warren Buffett, Iran, Japan, a bad jobs market, and I don't know, what else should we add in here? Oh, how about decades of bad monetary policy have in common? And the answer is a perfect storm. Like, kind of everything hit. I felt like we got 4 news cycles all in one news cycle because of everything going at the same time. And obviously, because this is an election year, everybody's going to have their explanations, and those explanations are going to tend to be whatever they think benefits them politically. And that's true on the right and the left. But what we want to do today is we really want to talk about, okay, no kidding. Why are these things happening? The stock market being the big one. All of your 401ks are currently being unburdened by what has been. But in the reality, actually, they are being burdened by what has been, because this didn't happen overnight. It's hugely predictable. It's not just because Kamala Harris, it is the nominee. It's not just because of what's going on in the Middle East. There's actually a lot of factors, a lot of international factors that actually play into what is happening. And so our goal this episode is to go through, analyze all this along with you, answer some of your questions from the audience, and hopefully everyone walks away with a better understanding of what's going on, and probably most importantly, like, what can you actually do about it? Because the good news with some of this is that there were economists that were calling all of this, right? The problem is they don't make it onto CNN, they don't make it onto MSNBC, heck, they don't even make it onto Fox, right? Because they're considered kind of on the outs, and we're going to get
they're weird.
Yeah, they're weird, right? They're weird now. The party of drag queens deciding what is weird. Drag Queen Story Hour for Kids is deciding what's weird. But we're going to talk a little bit about all of that. And again, I want to mention a little bit about the Austrian school economists, which we'll get into a little bit later as we're explaining kind of what's going on with the stock market, because time after time after time, they get it right. And yet they are repeatedly mocked by the establishment, by the mainstream media, and by politicians. And the whole reason for that is because the Austrian school, a little bit the Chicago school as well, but definitely the Austrian school, is probably the one economic school which significantly downplays the importance of politicians and the role they play within the economy, at least, in the positive role. And that's why they're not popular with politicians. That's why they're not popular with the mainstream media, but they repeatedly get it right. So we're going to talk a little bit about what makes their method of analyzing economics different and why it's so effective. But before we get into all of that, before we talk about the potential doom and gloom, World War III and the whole deal, if you really want to know what you can do to prepare for, pending economic collapse and warfare, you can stock up on steak. Right? Because I've never been in a situation, and I've been to war, I've never been in a situation where steak didn't make it better. And Good Ranchers has got you covered. That's right. If you want to support the show, plus you want to support yourself, plus you need more proteins, right? GoodRanchers.com. Go to GoodRanchers.com right now. They got a special deal. Here's the deal. Ready? You need to see this. This is awesome. So if you sign up for one of the subscriptions, right? Sign up for one of the subscriptions, you're going to get your choice of free meat for 4 years. So you keep that subscription for 4 years. They're going to just send you free meat with every subscription. You get to choose between boneless chicken breasts, Angus ground beef, Applewood smoked bacon, or wild-caught sockeye or king salmon. I'm telling you right now, this is excellent. The nice thing is if you get the bacon, you can wrap everything in the bacon. It's one of the most wonderful things about bacon. You're telling me that I can feed kitchen scraps to an animal and that animal will turn it into bacon? You tell me there's no God. There absolutely is one. That's proof of it. So go to goodranchers.com, put in promo code Nick, and not only are you going to get everything I just mentioned, plus you're going to get $25 off your order and free express shipping, right? It's coming right to your door. If you're like me and you don't particularly like to go to the store in order to shop for stuff, goodranchers.com, promo code Nick. You can go to the link in the description and get all of that. You're not only going to help yourself, you're not only going to help a really, really good company, but you're also going to help the show. So go ahead and check that out. All right. Let's go ahead and jump into this. We got our first one here. Christian, you are one of the people that I know in my circle of friends that whenever there is a complex economic question to be answered, you get positively giddy. Like this is like going to a rave for you. So tell us a little bit.
Bread and butter right here.
Well, and again, there's a lot of people the simple answer for all this, if you're a Democrat, is it's greedy corporations, right, or whatever. If you're a Republican, it's like, oh, it's because Kamala Harris is horrible and the economy hates her and the whole deal. Let's actually get into some of the things that are going on, because it does speak to economic policy, but it's not quite as simple as an answer as people would like. So take it.
The TLDR is that the specter of the 1980s Japanese asset bubble apparently still haunts the entire world, not just Japan itself. And here's the reason why. So, and this is also going to get into ties to the United States in terms of not just economics, but specifically monetary policy. So back in the 80s, you had this giant boom in Japan. If you're old enough, I'm not, but I mean, you actually remember this. There was this like genuine fear that
if you're old enough, I'm not, but this old guy over here
across the table from
you
me.
with the gray in your beard, you remember.
But I mean, you've told me, and if you watch enough like movies or pop culture and stuff like that, you from that time period, that there was this like real fear that like Japan was going to like conquer the world economically. They were like Die Hard actually, features like, Japanese CEOs and stuff like that. So anyway, Japan's economy was roaring in the 1980s, although a huge reason why was because of manipulation of monetary policy, which is something that we're going to just keep circling back around to in today's episode. But long story short, all good things come to an end. And after having an incredible decade, the Japanese stock market began to implode in the 1990s because there was a massive real estate bubble in Japan, so much so that the Imperial Palace in Tokyo was estimated to be worth more than all of the real estate in California. I think the Japanese real estate market at one point was priced at 4 times the entire real estate market in all of the U.S. And
isn't that nuts?
For those that are fans of geography, Japan's a lot smaller than the United States. So long story short, Japan's imploding. There's this massive credit crunch that takes place almost immediately after the new year in 1990. And the response from the government in Japan is massively cut interest rates and flood the market with cash. Although they did it too late. They actually kept raising interest rates going into a recession, which turned it into what's known as the lost decades. At first, it was the lost decade, and then it kept going, and so then it became the lost 2 decades. And then it kept going even further, and now it's become like just the lost 30 years.
Yeah.
So long story short, Japan had a really terrible 1990s, relatively terrible 2000s, and also a relatively terrible 2010s. But after about 2012 or so, things slowly started to recover. But you didn't really see the results until after 2020, after COVID, basically. Now, what's happened recently, though, is that there's a lot of turmoil going on, and what's happening in Japan is actually spilling over into the United States, and there's actually a specific reason why, because what led to the bubble in Japan also is related to the United States. That's a bit of a spoiler alert that we might get to later in today's podcast, but I've got a couple links here that I'm just going to fly through the headlines to illustrate what's happened in the last couple days. So here's something from CNBC. It's titled, Japan's Nikkei logs worst day since 1987 Black Monday crash. That was a very bad day for the stock market around the entire world. It fell 25% in the US. What I find so fascinating, though, is that the Nikkei, which is their major stock market index, it's their equivalent basically of like the NASDAQ or the S&P 500, actually had its worst day a couple days ago than it did during the 1990s bubble implosion. Although what's fascinating is that yesterday, the Nikkei was up like 10% after being down 12%. Yeah. So it's incredible volatility right now, or just huge. It's trading basically like an altcoin. Yeah. Like Shiba Inu or something like that. But speaking of which, here's our second link, actually. This is also from CNBC. Japan's Nikkei sees best day since October 2008. Logs record single day jump in points. So again, you just see a lot of volatility going on right now. Now, here's the reason why all of this is happening, and this is where we're going to get into the meat of the economic side of today's podcast. This is right here, the reason why this is happening. This is from the Associated Press. Bank of Japan raises its key interest rate, aiming to curb yen's slide against the dollar. And this came out literally just a few days ago. This was on the last day of July. It was the second time this year that they've raised interest rates. First time was, I believe, back in March. And they've raised it to a whopping, drum roll, 0.25%.
Yeah.
So yeah, this is apparently what has created the panic. This right here.
So let's put this in perspective. So I'm gonna summarize some of this for people right off the bat. Let's put this in perspective. So essentially, in Japan, the central bank of Japan had gotten to a point, and the government in Japan had gotten to a point where they were essentially paying you to take out loans. Right? So interest rates being zero means I'm going to loan you money, and you've got to pay back the money, but there's no interest on it. And because of inflation, having the money right now is actually better than what you're actually going to have to pay back in the future, right? So, but now they're paying you to essentially take out loans. So what do? Well, obviously, that's not a signal of a strong currency. If they are paying you to take their money, that is not an indication that your currency is strong. So what do you do if you have access to this? Because lo and behold, it turns out the average Japanese citizen wasn't able to go down and get a bunch of money from the government, get paid to do it or get, zero interest loans. You had to be in a privileged place to be able to do some of this. You go and you buy assets that actually have real value. Ostensibly you want ones with appreciating value. So real estate is a good example of this. So if my government is giving me money for free to go and invest, I'm not going to just keep that money because it's losing value. I'm going to go out and I'm going to automatically try to buy up assets that are going to increase in value over time. So that could be stuff within the stock market. That could be real estate. It could be any number of things. Now, here's what happens, right? I still have to pay back the money that I took out. I still got to pay it back. But now if the interest rate goes up, all of a sudden, now I owe more than I did before. So if I don't have enough cash on hand in order to pay that debt, or if I don't have an asset that's regularly making money that can cover the debt, I now have to sell the asset, right? Maybe I make a profit, maybe I make twice, just depends. I now have to sell the asset because I have to pay back, more money than I was having to pay previously. And so that's going to cause people to dump assets in order to get that cash in order to go back and pay the interest on the debt that they have.
Precisely. And
Christian, you were mentioning something before we started about how the Japanese government does their stock purchases and things like that.
So Nick was grabbing a coffee right before we started filming, and I was talking to Tia, and I was like, it's incredible in Japan over the last 12 years or so that the Bank of Japan, the central bank over there, has gone above and beyond even what our Federal Reserve does to try to boost the economy. I mean, they've been applying MMT since before we did. And again, we'll get into that. MMT is modern monetary theory. Like in Japan, the central bank will print money, and they will go into the open market and be like, yeah, we'll buy a Nintendo stock with our freshly printed money.
Yeah.
The Federal Reserve doesn't even do that. They will print money and they will buy treasury bonds.
Yes.
Now, in 2020, they were doing something extraordinary, and they were buying corporate bonds. They were trying to prop up just the broader bond market, not just on the sovereign side.
And again, to give everyone an idea, when they say that the Federal Reserve goes in and buys treasury bonds, what that is the federal government is printing money. The Federal Reserve is then taking that money to buy the treasury bonds, which means they're giving it to the government. So now the government has money to spend, right, after they've just printed it. So the government is, and this is one of the most nefarious things about inflationary monetary policy, is that it doesn't just cause all prices to raise instantaneously. Once that money goes into circulation, then the market starts to respond and things go up based off of the increased demand for those products, right?
So the government gets the full purchasing power, but
boom.
But then once it filters through,
you're screwed.
There's no more.
Your savings turns to crap. The wages that you're making turns to crap. But the government got the full value of that dollar when they initially started spending it.
So they basically stole it from you.
Yes.
Yeah, but what's
it is legal
interesting
counterfeiting.
To me is what Christian was saying about how in Japan, they will go in and they will just target specific stocks and inflate just that stock.
Yeah, the central bank
completely manipulate the stock market.
I remember a few months ago, I told Nick, Nick, did you know that the Bank of Japan is the largest shareholder of, X number of companies? I can't remember the number off the top of my head, but it was a huge chunk of the Japanese stock market. And I was like, did you know that the single largest shareholder is the Bank of Japan? And then, Nick, I remember you were like, oh, they're screwed. And I was like, how? And you were like, do you understand how dangerous of a situation that is, where the central bank is like the largest shareholder? And remember, this is a country where the debt to GDP ratio is over 200%.
Yeah.
In the US, it's not even 100. Actually, it is over 100% at this point, but it's only barely over 100%, although we're catching up fast. But what this creates is a circumstance where they cannot raise interest rates, because if you raise interest rates too much, you'll get a sovereign debt crisis. Not only a sovereign debt crisis, you'll get individual companies going bankrupt. You'll get you'll get investors, you'll get corporations, you'll get banks, and you'll get the government itself all going bankrupt because they're too over leveraged. So this chart here that I've got from Trading Economics, which shows the long-term interest rate in Japan going back, 50 years, going back to 1973. The trajectory it's a downward trajectory, right?
Yeah.
This period in the 80s, from 1983 to, basically 1990, is the bubble period. And you can see why the bubble formed, right? Interest rates just kept dropping throughout the 80s, and especially after 1985. But then they started raising in 1987 and 1988 and 1989 and 1990, and that's what popped the bubble.
Yeah.
And then the response from the central bank was basically, yeah, we're going to take it from 6% to 0. And they've kept it at 0 basically since 1998. But by keeping it at 0 for almost 30 years, what you've done is you've allowed for an over-leveraging of the economy.
Yeah.
So now what they're having in Japan is the opposite problem. They had a credit crunch in the 90s, where banks were wiped out, corporations were wiped out, investors were wiped out. And so the response from the government is, we're going to lower interest rates and print money in order to try to juice the economy. Now they've overjuiced it in the sense that they have inflation after decades of deflation.
Yeah.
But they can't raise interest rates too much because the government is so indebted at this point that if you raise, again, even a tiny increase in interest rates result in a massive increase in interest payments. And so there's this video that I ran into on X that in 90 seconds explains the nature of the problem and explains the carry trade, which is part of the reason that we've seen turmoil in American markets, because we've been talking about Japan a lot. So how does this affect the United States? Here's the reason why, and it explains it in just a minute and a half. And I thought this was incredibly informative.
Yeah.
You're going to want to read it off, though, because it doesn't have any audio. But for our video listeners, it's
so it says yen carry trade, how to lose easy money fast. Okay, number 1, traders borrow money in a low interest rate currency. 2, they convert that money into another currency. They invest the new currency. It's going too fast.
They invested at a 0% interest to get a guaranteed profit.
Yeah.
How the trade loses money. I'll pause it as you go along.
Okay, 1, yen yield goes up, new currency yield goes down. Yen new currency conversion rate goes down, and then they show you an example. Borrow yen, 1 billion yen. Convert to U.S. dollars, $6.9 million. Buy assets, $6.9 million in a government bond. Profit, $276,000 per year. What could go wrong? What if the U.S. dollar and yen exchange rate goes down to 10%? You still owe 1 billion yen. So 6.9 million to 1 billion yen ends up to be 7.7 million to 1 billion yen. And then it goes through the process again, explaining it. I'm going to be honest, I don't think this is actually the best explanation. But
So basically, it turns a guaranteed profit into a guaranteed loss.
Yeah.
And I got to hide my bar here so that
Yeah.
way I can actually see this. Basically, when the currency rate changes between these two currencies,
Yeah.
what you end up getting is a guaranteed profit turns into a guaranteed loss.
Here's the thing that I want people to understand about why this is impacting the stock market right now, right? Is because this is all a result. Japan is not the only one that has been doing this sort of market manipulation and this sort of currency manipulation. They've probably been doing it at a rate and to a degree that is extreme compared with the United States and other parts of the world. But understand that the reason why the United States gets away with a lot of currency manipulation because we're the world's reserve currency. Right? And what that means is that there are certain commodities on the market like oil that get traded in dollars. And so people have to use dollars in order to get access to certain commodities. And that gives us a competitive advantage within the currency marketplace. But what everyone needs to understand is kind of what we already talked about earlier on this. A lot of chickens are coming home to roost. The government wants to spend money, which means politicians want to spend money. There is a really, what I think, perverse statement in Washington, D.C., and just in government in general, and that is nobody ever lost an election for spending too much money. And the reason why is because the immediate feedback loop, right, especially if I'm on a 2-year election cycle. So if I vote for budgets, which spend a ton of money, right, ton of money, but you get some of it, or you like how it sounds, like, oh, we invested more money in higher education. Oh, well, that seems good. We invested more money in higher education, right? I get rewarded for that electorally, even if the investment was bad, even if the investment 2 years from now, 3 years from now, 4 years from now produces negative economic results. Even if the same people that are sitting there complaining that why is it that corporate profits are going up, but wages seem to remain stagnant? It's because of this. It is because of this. It's not this myth that one day corporations or companies woke up and just became greedy. Corporations and companies always want to make money. You know who else wants to make money? Labor. Everybody wants to make money. The difference is that corporations and labor don't get to go to the Federal Reserve, don't get to go to the U.S. Treasury and say, print a bunch of money because we really want to spend it. The government does do this. And the end result is that if you actually want to talk about the sort of income inequality that we're seeing right now, this is not a result of the free market or greedy corporations in and of themselves. This is a direct result of the government engaging in inflationary monetary policy in order to subsidize the insatiable need for the federal government to spend more money, and it resulting in your savings getting wiped out. It results in the real estate prices across the economy increasing exponentially. And if you're wondering, why is it that this is hurting everybody, but a certain select group of people keep getting wealthier as a result, it's because they got access to the money first. And everybody that voted for that inflationary monetary policy knew that's what would happen. But then they can turn around and, oh, look how good the stock market is. Stock market's doing well. The economy must be doing well. Yeah, it should be that way. The stock market should be a reflection of a healthy economy, provided that stocks are going up because of increased productivity. But if they're going up because of increased speculation, because of trillions of dollars got sent into the economy, there will be negative consequences to that. And there will come a time when the chickens come home to roost and your savings crashes and certain stocks that should have never been as high as they were because it was artificial speculation start to tank. And then all of a sudden, you know what's going to happen next? Those same politicians are going to come out and say, we need stimulus funds. We need to stimulate the economy. That's the problem. Interest rates were too high, or this was too low, or we need to tinker with it more.
We need to curb speculation.
Because all they're worried about is their next election cycle, not sound monetary policy and certainly not sound economic theory. This is why, I'm probably jumping into this a little bit early, but I want to hit onto this. The Austrian school has been saying all along, if you conduct your monetary policy this way, if you conduct government spending this way, you are going to end up with a boom and bust cycle because you're sending perverse incentives into the economy. And now people are not investing based off of what the most sound investment is within a productive marketplace. They're investing based off of what the Federal Reserve is going to do, what the government is due, what sort of special advantages is the government going to give to certain industries as opposed to other industries. And so now you've manipulated the entire investment process. And it's really easy for Elizabeth Warren to come back and say, oh, it's just greedy corporations. They're responding to what you did, Liz.
That's what kind of gets me is the way that the government talks about inflation. They'll look you straight in the eye and be like, inflation's down to 3%. Well, they're saying month over month, percentage month over month. But if we go back to, just a few years ago, the percentage is much higher. They're not very honest about how they package the data.
No.
And I noticed they do the same thing with, crime rates. They do the same thing. They sort of cook the books where what they're saying is technically true within the parameters of how they want you to view it. But if you were to step back and look at the whole picture, it's much more dire than what they try to package to us.
That's an excellent point. And it's one of the reasons why the major difference, because I've had people ask me before, okay, great. So you got the Keynesians, you got the monetary theorists, you've got the traditionalists, you've got the monetarists. What makes the Austrian school of economics so much different than all of the other schools? And one of the biggest things that I can point to is that whereas a lot of the other economic schools focus a lot on this seems to make sense, right? I bring in a bunch of data, I look at the data over time, and then I start to predict how I can positively impact the economy based off of manipulating it in just such a way in order to increase productivity or increase spending or whatever it is, right? The Austrian school is, to my knowledge, one of the only ones that starts off with a very, very basic principle, and it's called praxeology. And that's just a fancy way of saying people act and react. They respond to incentives. And so what the Austrian school said was, we're not going to focus on a bunch of charts because the charts might explain something that happened at a particular point in time, but it doesn't actually explain what is driving people's interest, the interest of billions of people across the globe on a day-to-day basis. And so they came up with theories like things like marginal utility. What does that mean? Communists, and even to some degree Adam Smith, believed in this idea of the labor theory of value. And what that was that if I look at this coffee mug and I look at the labor that went into making this coffee mug, and I want to try to determine what is the value of this coffee mug, well, I would look at the sum total of the parts of the labor. That's the ceramics that went into making it. That's the company that ended up shipping it. That's the people that put the little logo on it or designed the logo. I take into all those various factors, and the price that I get at the end based off of all the labor represents the value of the mug. That's the labor theory of value. The Austrian school said, no, it's based off of supply and demand. That's what actually determines what the value. The demand is what actually determines the value in relation to how much of it is available. And here's, if you want an easy example of why this makes sense. If you took all the labor and what it would take to dig a ditch from Philadelphia to Los Angeles with a spork, right? If you added up all the labor that was involved in creating the spork, right? And all the people that would be necessary in order to dig it using exclusively sporks, getting all the way there, you would actually come up with an incredibly expensive ditch that would have zero value because nobody wants it, and that's a stupid way to do it.
But there'd be a lot of labor going into it.
But there'd be a lot of labor going into it. No, it's the demand. It's like, how much do I want something? Now, the reason why that is so important is because what the Austrian school focuses on whenever they're looking at economic impacts, whenever they're looking at policy, is they're always trying to address the question, how many decisions are you taking away from individual consumers to be able to make the decisions based off of their needs, wants, and desires, and putting it into the hands of bureaucrats that cannot possibly know what billions of people interacting on a daily basis actually want. And so the Austrian school focuses a lot on deductive reasoning. If you do this, this is how it's going to impact. This is the perverse incentive that's going to take place. They're not as interested in how do we gather, a million different charts, because there will always be data that you leave out. There will always be data that gets manipulated in a certain way that causes you to miscalculate.
This has to be reiterated, in part because, we actually wrote a Y-Minute on this specific topic recently about why socialism literally cannot work. It's not actually good in theory, terrible in practice. It's terrible in theory and terrible in practice. And the reason why is because of something called the knowledge problem and the economic calculation problem. The knowledge problem basically posits that no central planner will ever be able to identify what are the needs of every single person out there. There's just not, the information is impossible to accumulate. Now, some Austrian economists have actually said technically with enough tyrannical force and enough research, you could maybe overcome the knowledge problem, but you cannot overcome the economic calculation problem because prices are an indication of the demand of a product. So when you nationalize everything, right, if you seize the means of production and you abolish prices because everything is now owned collectively by, the worker co-op or whatever, really the state, what you've now done is you've effectively eliminated prices, which now means that you have no way to identify how to efficiently allocate resources, because people leave this out. People have this idea that prices represent greed. Prices are actually a representation of supply and demand. Prices represent where resources need to be most efficiently allocated. If the price of something is very high, that inherently means that demand is either very high and it can't keep up with supply, or supply is very limited and it can't keep up with demand. And if there's a way to balance those out, if there's a way to increase supply, now sometimes you can't.
Yeah.
Like historically, until recently, you couldn't increase the supply of diamonds. Nowadays you can, right? But that's the reason why diamonds were so expensive for so long, because you couldn't just artificially increase the supply of it, but there was always a constant demand, and that's why the prices were high. Now, if you abolish prices, you have no way of identifying how scarce a resource is or how badly needed a resource is in a certain area. The analogy that I've used is, imagine you're trying to build a skyscraper in a city. Well, if you don't have any prices, you don't know how much concrete you should put into it. You don't know how much glass you should put into it. You don't even know what type of building to turn it into. Should it be an apartment building? Should it be an office building? Should it be a mixed use building? Should you have a shopping mall or not? You won't be able to identify what to even do with the building, let alone how to construct it, if you don't have prices. And so the economic calculation problem is literally impossible to solve under a socialist or centrally planned system. And I mean, that alone debunks central planning, but consider the amount of income inequality that you get from meddling with the market. So it's not just the central planning side. It's also because, let's be honest, a lot of people on the left nowadays are not actually saying seize the means of production.
Yeah.
A lot of progressives nowadays are championing basically what they did here. I'm going to show you this chart that they did with the, to circle back around to Japan for one final time. With their balance sheet with the central bank. You have a lot of people that aren't saying, oh, let's seize the means of production. Instead, you have a lot of progressives. You have a lot of liberals that say things like, well, we just need, the government needs to do something to solve whatever the crisis is, right? Helicopter Ben, right? Print the money and distribute it. We all remember March of 2020 when the response from everybody was, oh, the world is ending. The government must do something. We need stimulus checks. Well, they gave us they bribed us with $1,400 checks, and we ended up getting hit with the highest inflation in 40 years. Yeah. And it's not surprising why. In the case of Japan, look at this correlation here between the balance of the central bank, which I'll let you explain what that entails, and the stock market in Japan. Look at that correlation here. So to explain this for our audio listeners that might not be looking at this first chart shows how much money is on the balance sheet of the central bank. Again, this is money that's been created out of thin air. And this chart shows that it began in Q4 of 2012. This is actually, in some ways, a ding against the legacy of Shinzo Abe. He's a very popular guy for a lot of good reasons. And I think he did a lot of good stuff in Japan outside of monetary policy. But unfortunately, Abe was kind of the first MMT prime minister in Japan. And he had this idea. It was called Abenomics, or Abenomics, depending on whether or not you're English. Of basically print money, inject it into the markets, and that's how you're going to fix the lost 3 decades. And he did exactly that. The central bank printed money. You see that the amount of yen on the balance sheet is now currently sitting at 756,000 billion yen. So there's some trillions in there for those that wanted to do the math. In 2012, it was only 151,000 billion yen. So that's a massive, basically like 6-7x increase since 2012. And what we see is a direct correlation between when the money printing began and when the stock market in Japan began to rise. I mean, literally a direct correlation.
And the reason why this always happens is because of who gets access to the money first. And if you were getting the money first, and this has just been printed, right? You have to get it into assets as quickly as possible, because the money, the currency you're holding on to, is literally losing value. And every minute you're holding on to it. The important thing to remember is, once again, what is currency? The little pictures of dead presidents on Federal Reserve notes are not in and of themselves intrinsically valuable. They're only valuable in relation to the actual goods and services that they can command within the economy. And so if you're just arbitrarily printing more of them, they decrease in value. So it's not as if your home is increased in value. Your money has decreased in value. That's what's been going on. But the people that get that money first and then invest it into something that actually has real tangible value, right? Gold, stocks, real estate, whatever it is, right? They can actually increase their wealth in an inflationary economy, while everybody else that is essentially living paycheck to paycheck or dependent on wages or dependent on Social Security, your overall net wealth is dropping. If you're relying on your savings, your wealth is dropping. So do not buy the crap that is coming from the politicians that are telling you that this is all just about greedy market economy. We need more government regulation. The government created these conditions through inflationary monetary policy in order to support their own spending habits, right? They knew it was going to happen. There's no way you can tell me Elizabeth Warren doesn't understand this concept. But if you honestly believe that the real key to future prosperity and greater equity within society is greater government control over the economy, well, then this is the sort of behavior that you're going to engage in. We got a couple of questions here I want to get to real quick. Let me see here. There's one. I'm trying to find it here. Okay. Question. How can we prepare for a long crash as a young person? That's from Looky Lucky. Listen, I'm going to say right now, I don't give financial advice to people. The thing I would tell you is that if you're really concerned about like a significant economic crash, one of the reasons why we talk so much about the importance of family, the importance of intentional community, and all of those things is like during COVID, a lot of us kind of realized, oh, the government can, potentially prevent me from working. The government can prevent me from going and seeing medical professionals or getting access to medicines that I want. They can all of a sudden the grocery stores don't have what I want. This is why I talk about, again, complex economies, complex, diverse economies are a good thing until the government decides that they want to arbitrarily shut you down or set rules that are not beneficial to you. It is important for you to actually know who are the people that grow food, right? Who are the people that have access to skills and capabilities? And likewise, you developing skills and capabilities, that always has value. That always has value because there's only so much the government can ultimately do to restrict your ability to engage in productive activity within the economy. So I always tell people the one foolproof investment that you can make is developing your own marketable skill sets and capabilities and things that actually matter. So that's one thing I would say. Again, people can talk about real estate, they can talk about stocks, they can talk about all kinds of other investments, and I will leave that to the professionals. But I will say that you will never be worse off for developing marketable skill sets that people within your community need and want to pay you for. There's another one here. Question: How do the recent economic events, along with Kamala's VP pick, affect y'all's election predictions? Love from Central Texas. Thank you, Nathan. We're actually going to get to that a little bit later on the show, specifically with the VP pick, because Christian and I both think it actually does have a significant impact on the election, and we're gonna talk a little bit more about what that actually looks like. Deli asked the question: How can we reverse this inflation? Can we rebalance cost of living and wages? The answer is yes. Now,
really, because I was going to say no.
We're
going to disagree.
It can be done. It's just not going to be. That's what I would say. The question is, can it be done? Yes. The question is, how would you do it? You actually have to move. I would say you have to move back to a commodity-based currency. You can't just have fiat currency is nothing more than it's just paper currency, and it's backed by nothing except the full faith and credit of the United States government. All the way up into the 70s, all the way up into the 1970s, U.S. currency was backed by something, which is to say gold, silver, there was some sort of commodity, there was some sort of asset that your dollar was tied to. And here's what that did. It prevented the federal government from just printing more money as much as it wanted in order to pay for spending projects, because it had to be tied to something. And this was part of an international agreement. Nixon got rid of it in the 1970s, in part because we were about to lose all of our gold.
We had printed too much.
We had printed too much, and that's why, again, gold was going to be fleeing the country. And so the end result is we move to a straight fiat currency, and that's where you see this massive shift in what drove the U.S. economy, what drove wages, all of that factored into it. So you actually have to get back to sound monetary policy. The question is there any real political incentive or drive to do that? And I would say that with the exception of people like Thomas Massey or Rand Paul or maybe Mike Lee and some others, there's maybe
10 people in total in DC.
Is that people don't want the hard times that would come in order to correct this.
Yeah.
They've been putting off the hard times since 1987.
Austerity is not popular.
No.
Nobody wants to have to tighten their belt and, tighten down the budget. No one wants to do that. We all love to spend. There's a reason why the government is so spend happy, it's because we as a society are spend happy. Like, we want our luxuries. We want what we want, and we don't want to wait. We don't want to have to save up. And so I don't think it's just a government sickness. I think it's sort of the sickness that we kind of all have, where we don't want to put in place austerity measures. And I think that those type of things would be just a huge election loser.
Well, let's put it this way. Nobody really talks about the Great Depression of like or 1920. And the reason why is because we didn't have one, right? So that's a good reason. However, if you actually look at the economic downturn that took place in the stock market in the late 19-teens and early 20s, it was arguably more significant than Black Tuesday. That theoretically, it didn't, but theoretically, you're taught that it kicked off the Great Depression. The Great Depression was not kicked off by the stock market crash in 1929. The Great Depression was kicked off by government intervention in response to it. The big difference between 1929 and the early 1920s is that, one, Woodrow Wilson suffered a stroke. You didn't have the same government apparatus to involve itself. Woodrow Wilson wasn't at the helm. His wife was essentially running the country at that particular time.
Wait, that sounds familiar.
There wasn't a lot they could do. Not to mention the fact that when Warren G. Harding and Calvin Coolidge were coming into office, Warren G. Harding was the last president, in his inaugural address said we have to practice aggressive deflation. We have to return to normalcy. We can't be sustaining this kind of wartime spending that we're doing. It doesn't make any sense. And that was in his inaugural address, which was nuts, right?
And he's considered one of the worst presidents of all time.
Which is garbage, because Calvin Coolidge was the Roaring 20s were the Roaring 20s. Now, you can argue about speculation. Sure, speculation happens, absolutely. But Calvin Coolidge was the last president to leave the federal government smaller than when he arrived. Now, what happened in 1929 was that the stock market crashed due to wild speculation, or to poor speculation, which happens, right? And then the economy started to recover. Unemployment was under double digits before the federal government started to massively intervene in the economy, first under Hoover and then under FDR. And unemployment stayed high. Prices were problematic. That's where you actually had a Great Depression. It was the government intervention, not just, a stock market crash. The important thing to understand is that kind of broke the way that people looked at the government's role in interfering into the economy. Before that, it was not assumed that the government was supposed to play this massive role. Wilson started it. FDR sealed the deal. And from then on, every single U.S. president with varying degrees has assumed that, the role is that when the economy is tanking, you stimulate it. And the way that you stimulate it is through government spending. Well, how does the government get your money? Well, they can tax it, they can borrow it, or they can print it. And the problem is that if you overtax, you actually, you disincentivize economic investment and growth. If you borrow too much of it, well, at some point people don't want to borrow they don't want to give you money anymore to pay for your treasury bonds. So printing becomes the last resort that the government can utilize. And usually all they need is a crisis in order to justify that spending. And because the inflation doesn't take place immediately, because it usually takes year, 2 years, sometimes 3 years in order to fully be recognized, well, somebody else can take the blame for it.
So remember that chart that I showed you of the amount of money printing that's been going on in Japan? Like, this has been going on since 2012. Well, really, it's been going on since the bubble imploded in the 90s. But it's really ramped up since 2012. But you didn't see it overnight. You're only seeing it now, 12 years later, that inflation's coming back. 12 years for the results of that policy that was initiated in 2012 to start showing itself. And the irony is that Abenomics worked. And that's actually the problem, because the money printing has now created this inflationary environment. And now this country has inflation, which is why they're having to raise interest rates. But again, when they raise interest rates, they're crashing their own markets because everybody's over leveraged because they got used to 30 years of 0% interest rates. And the same thing is playing out in the United States, just on a smaller scale, right? Like, we've seen record high interest rates, and now things are starting to fall apart in large part because the country's over leveraged. We've also seen falling interest rates for a very long time. So to get back to that question about the disagreement between Nick and I that actually really wasn't a disagreement. I don't think that you can stop what's going to happen. To quote Lynn Alden, who's an economist that I really enjoy, her takes are phenomenal, and I've got one more thing to share from her before we're done with today's podcast. Nothing stops this train. That's the meme that she keeps sharing. It's from Breaking Bad. And like anytime somebody shows her a graph, it's like, oh, the spending's accelerating. What are we going to do here? And she's just always like, well, nothing. Because nothing's going to stop what's to come. To give you an idea, so here's what the VIX showed, right? The VIX is an indicator of volatility, and usually that's a sign of like, oh, the market is lacking confidence of what's going to happen next. Usually it's the sign of like a big downturn coming. And what we see is what's happened in the last couple days with huge collapses followed by huge surges has been that the VIX index is at its third highest level since the 2008 crash. So you have, this chart shows the 2008 crash where the VIX was, it was almost at 100, which is just utterly unprecedented. And then you had COVID, where it was also almost at 100, and then you had this that just happened.
Yeah.
So that's a sign right there that we might be heading to a recession. This is also a sign, though. Berkshire Hathaway sells off large share of Apple and increases cash holdings. Warren Buffett's firm now holds $227 billion in cash, which, that right there is kind of a bearish sign. Buffett has been selling stuff left and right lately. Yeah. And this guy, he's one of the only people to have consistently beaten the stock market for almost 70 years now. So he knows his stuff better than me, better than most traders.
I think he anticipates that we are headed towards some economic hard times, and I think he's going to be able. I think he thinks he's going to be able to buy up assets, and he wants cash on hand to be able to do it.
He did the same thing in 2008. He was building a cash position, and then after the crash in 2008, he went out there and he bought a railroad.
Yeah,
that's a sign. Here's another sign though, that we might be heading towards a recession. This is the unemployment rate. Now this goes all the way back to 1950. So let's zoom this in a little bit more to, let's say, the last 20 years or so. So here's the unemployment rate about 20 years ago. And you see it started to increase even before we went into a recession. The gray bar here indicates a recession. So a technical recession according to the government's own indicators. So this was the great financial crisis in 2008 and 2009. This is the very blip, this is COVID when everybody, this is COVID when Tim Walz decided that he wanted to, force everybody in Minnesota to go on unemployment in March and April in 2020.
That's your new vice presidential candidate, by the way.
So what you see though is in a normal recession, right? Because this is abnormal, right, in 2020. But in a normal recession, you see that it starts to increase before the markets implode. So the markets imploded in really September and October of 2008. But you see that unemployment was inching higher, all the way back in late 2007. Now, what do we see today is that unemployment has actually slowly started been marching higher. There's a couple of quirky economic rules that I'm not going to get into the details of, but one of them basically says that when the unemployment rate is about 0.5% higher than the rolling average was 12 months earlier, that's a sign that you're probably going to get a recession. And we've crossed that with the last jobs report that came out, which normally, ironically enough, would actually result in the stock market going higher, because the market would have been pricing in interest rate cuts. Mm-hmm. As paradoxical as this sounds, the market wants a recession because they want lower interest rates.
Yeah.
Now,
if they get a recession, the Fed's knee-jerk response will be, we got to lower interest rates in order to stimulate economic development, and that always benefits the stock market. It doesn't necessarily benefit you. It just benefits the stock market.
Yeah. But the problem is there's too many other factors at play here that have resulted in what would have been the market gaining really just more being the market is just incredibly volatile right now. It's flying up and then it's flying down, and it's going all over the place. And the reason why is because of Japan, what we talked about. It's because of people like Buffett who can actually move the markets in some respects when he sells tens of billions of dollars of things like Apple.
Sure.
It's also stuff in the Middle East, which we might be talking about.
We're going to talk about that a little bit.
It's potentially Harris's VP pick, who is not market friendly at all, obviously.
Well, and this is the part I want to get into, because again, one of the biggest differences between a lot of the other schools and the Austrian school takes a far more simple approach to understanding a lot of this. And that is, quite frankly, okay, your unemployment numbers are high. Why is that? Well, a lot of other schools will throw you a bunch of charts at you. Oh, it's this factor, it's this factor, it's this combination of factors. The Austrian school pretty much looks at these things and goes, have you made it more difficult to hire people? If the answer is yes, then you're going to have higher unemployment. Now that seems very, very simple, but I cannot tell you how many arguments I get in with my colleagues in the General Assembly who do not understand this very simple principle. Have you drastically increased minimum wages? Yes. Okay, well then that's going to have a downward pressure on hiring people that would fill those jobs. Well, no, it won't, because you see this chart over here. No, it will. You've increased the cost. You've increased the cost of labor in this particular field. You've made it higher. That is going to negatively impact employment. Have you paid people? Have you increased welfare benefits to such a degree where you pay people to sit home and do nothing? Yes. Okay. Have you created within the legal labor market in the United States difficulties with getting hired that don't apply to the illegal labor market in the United States? At the same time that you have a massive influx of people coming into the economy to fill illegal labor positions. Yes. Okay. Well, that's going to have a negative impact on employment. Like, it is not difficult to figure this out once you look at incentive structures. When you create an economic environment where it is easy for people to hire people that want a job, when you create an economic environment where you don't pay people to do nothing, you're going to get better employment numbers. When you do the opposite of those things, no matter how much you feel nice about what you're doing, no matter how much you truly believe that what you're doing is going to help people who really need it, if you are making it more difficult to hire people, fewer people will get hired. That's what we call deductive reasoning. And it turns out that there's no economic chart that you can throw out there that just diminishes the value of deductive reasoning. And that's one of the biggest problems that we have within the legislature. I cannot tell you how many colleagues I have that will sit there and be like, our bill is going to help poor people. It is going to make sure that we put more money in the pockets of the people that really need it. It's like, okay, but what does your bill actually do? Oh, well, it doubles the price associated with hiring low-skilled labor. Okay, then you're going to get less people getting hired for low-skilled labor positions, or you're going to get higher prices in order to match the increased cost that you just assigned to labor. Do you see how that works? And then the response to me is like, you just don't care about poor people. I care enough about poor people to actually understand how economics works. You apparently only care enough to make yourself feel better with respect to how your policy sounds.
The problem is that emotions sell better than cold hard facts.
100%. 100%.
I mean, a thrifty politician is an incompetent politician.
Oh, that is definitely true. I cannot tell you how many times. So I've been in the General Assembly 9 years. I think I voted for one budget. One. Because it was the only budget that we had while I was in that actually decreased taxes. And even that one, I didn't like the budget, but I was like, look, if I can encourage my colleagues to continue to recommend and vote for tax cuts, I'll do it. You know how many times I've been told, well, Nick, you're going to have to go back and explain to your constituents how you voted against funding for teachers and how you voted against funding for hospitals and how you voted. I'm like, okay, I'm willing to do it. Well, but nothing. I'm willing to go back and explain to my constituents the reason why I voted no on this budget is because of all of this excess spending that it does, because of the perverse incentives it creates, because that we're going to create a condition where one day the chickens will come home to roost. And I had that moment last year when I had a whole bunch of people from local governments saying, hey, is the state going to be able to pick up the funds for these extra positions that we needed? No. Well, why not? Don't have the money. Well, can we lean on the federal government? You mean the one that's $33 trillion in debt?
Oh, it's 35 now.
$35 trillion in debt? No. Well, why not? Well, do you remember when you were advocating for all these increased government programs and spending, and I told you that we didn't have enough productivity in order to actually finance those programs, and so that we were funding it all basically by taking out the federal government credit card, printing money, or borrowing more money and then sending it in, and then eventually the program would grow to a degree to where we didn't have the funding to actually finance it? And you told me I was mean? Well, we're here now.
Do you remember this conversation that you and I had with Rudyard? It was just us. Like we were in a kitchen room, and we were just having a chat with him for like 2 hours. It started talking about like technical stuff, right? Hamilton was actually there too. It was starting talking about technical stuff, but then it turned into a philosophical discussion. And I remember I said something to him, and I said, nobody ever lost to go back to what you said earlier. I remember telling him, I said, nobody ever lost an election for spending too much. but people have lost their heads for spending too much.
Yes. Yeah, that's kind of the that's kind of where it lands at. It's like it gets to a point where you can kick the can down the road far enough until you have a complete economic collapse, and then you're the one left holding the bag, and the consequences are not you lose your election. The consequences are you end up getting guillotined, right? We've got a couple of super chats I want to get to real quick. Charles Hurst, thank you very much for the super chat. He goes, can global free trade, sometimes that requires extremely large amounts of cash, exist without a fiat currency, or should we just give up on the idea of global trade altogether? I apologize if that sounds snarky. I didn't mean it that way. I certainly didn't take it that way. It's a good question. Here's what I would say. First of all, international trade does not require. When we talk about fiat currency, there's a difference between paper money, which is obviously easy to exchange, right? Or just, money where we're just changing numbers in accounts and no actual paper money even changes hand, right? It's just the amount of money that's in each account based off of trade. That can take place regardless. So no, you don't need a fiat currency in the sense that there's nothing backing the currency for global trade or for international trade to take place. Global trade, international trade has taken place forever, for centuries. And it's not a bad thing, by the way. There's some people, even on the conservative side, that will try to act like, global trade is a problem because it hurts domestic industry. It's like, well, I want Americans to be able to have access to the most amount of products possible. And I want them to be able to get the best price for those products. The issue that we run into, and this is something that Trump tried to address, right? I believe in free trade. What free trade means is that the government doesn't put any additional restrictions or taxes on the products that are being exchanged once it crosses international borders. And free trade, I believe, is a good thing because it allows me to maximize the amount of options available to me within the marketplace. Now, where you get into problems is when one country will say, okay, great, we'll sell you our products and you don't put any tariffs on them or any restrictions on them. But whenever you try to sell us your products, we are going to try to put restrictions on them before they come into our country. There is a very, very limited utility to saying we're going to put tariffs on your products if you put tariffs on ours, but only if the goal is no tariffs. All right. So I always go back to, I explain it kind of in the simplest terms possible. Trade is just that, right? The fewer restrictions we have on trade amongst individuals, the happier I generally am. It doesn't require fiat currency. It just requires people being able to engage in voluntary exchange into mutual benefit. The problem is when governments constantly get involved in order to try to either make money off of the transactions or to try to resist or restrict things in order to manipulate the economy. And we do. We have a lot of foreign governments that attempt to manipulate their economy to put American companies at a disadvantage. And I understand why that's so frustrated, and there are ways that you can deal with that. But I don't think you put yourself in a better position by just relying on fiat currency. The argument a lot of times is that if you lower the value of your own currency, you actually benefit your exports because people with stronger currencies can now buy more of the products. But think about that for a second. If that were true, then are you saying that you are in a better economic position if you're exporting more stuff? If more goods and services are leaving your country in order to get dollars or yen or pounds or marks from another country, are you better off as a result of that? I would argue that you're not necessarily, because ultimately true wealth is in the goods and the services. The currency is just a medium of exchange, right? So the goods and services is what actually makes a country or a nation or a people wealthy. And I don't think you have to manipulate your currency in order to gain wealth, because what we've seen, China did a lot of this. They manipulated their currency in order to increase their export market. And everyone was like, oh my gosh, they're in such great shape. Well, now you look at what the central planning and currency manipulation is meant for China. They're actually about to head toward a massive economic downturn, because when your economic well-being is determined not by free people being able to engage in voluntary cooperation and competition, but rather by government politicians and bureaucrats pulling all the strings, eventually the chickens come home to roost and your economy tanks. So I don't think the fiat currency is necessary for strong global trade. Barbara Boyden asked, thank you for the super chat. What about Fort Knox? I believe there is some gold there, but not like they say there is. What are your thoughts? When I was talking about the gold during the Nixon administration, was that under the Nixon, they had printed so much dollars, and the way that it used to be tied was that the more dollars you printed, right, your gold exchange, transferred. And so by them decoupling gold from currency, it didn't mean that we automatically lost all of our gold overnight. That's not what I was trying to claim. It was more the idea that all of a sudden now the dollar was completely untethered to any sort of commodity with intrinsic value. And so now, because it was just the full faith and credit of the United States, there was no legal mechanism that you could really use to prevent the United States government from just printing more currency in order to spend it. So the question anymore is not necessarily about how much gold the United States government has or that they have access to, because they've completely decoupled the currency from it in the first place. It doesn't have the same restrictive value toward what governments could do with their own currency as it did back when we were actually using that sort of commodity-based currency. I hope that answers the question. All right. We're going to move on to another topic here that we wanted to discuss, and that is another thing that is impacting the markets right now, because it's not just unemployment rates going up. It's not just the fact that you actually have, with a Harrison-Walz administration, you would actually have probably one of the most hostile administrations to the free market that we've had in a long time. That's all impacting numbers. It's inflationary monetary policy and interest rates in Japan. It's all of these factors that are coming together. But one of it does have to do with what's going on within the Middle East. And a lot of people, when they think the Middle East, they think oil. That's why this is impacting the United States. Now, keep in mind, the United States gets a very, very small fraction comparatively of our oil from the Middle East. But that doesn't mean that region is not important to us for other reasons, not the least of which is trade routes. The Suez Canal is arguably one of the top 3 most important trade routes in the world, along with the Panama Canal and the Malacca Straits in Southeast Asia. And so what happens in the Middle East does have an impact. The other reason why it has an impact is because there are certain regimes over there that believe that terrorism is an appropriate way to achieve political objectives. And so the United States relationship with Israel has not just been based off of, let's say, cultural ties to Israel, obviously the religious component with both, Christianity, Judaism, as well as Islam, and the importance of that portion of the world to, all 3 of those major world religions. But there's also been a strategic partnership there, in part because a lot of the Arab nations in the world sided with the Soviet Union during the Cold War, whereas Israel sided with the United States. Saudi Arabia also ended up siding with the United States in that exchange. The other thing that you also see is that the military assistance and whatnot that we give to Israel, there's a mutually beneficial component to there, because one, Israel does find themselves attacking terrorist organizations that also hate the United States and are opposed to U.S. interests. But there's also a benefit in the United States being able to sell U.S. military equipment to foreign militaries, because it actually does give us a strategic advantage when other countries are using our equipment. Now, they use an export version. They don't actually use the same exact version that we use in most cases. And so that also factors into this as well. But the big question that has been on the rise is that obviously the war that started when Hamas attacked Israel on October 7th, and then Israel has been going into Gaza trying to eliminate Hamas. Hezbollah, which is essentially a wholly owned subsidiary of Iran, right? The Islamic Revolutionary Guard Corps is an element of the Iranian military that operates through proxies is not always the appropriate word. Hamas might be more of a proxy. Hezbollah is more under direct control of Iran. They are funded predominantly by Iran. They are Khomeiniist in the way that they actually look at their both religious and political objectives for the region. Not to mention the fact that Hezbollah, I think, represents the 3rd largest army technically on paper within that region. It's massive. It is significant. It is orders of magnitude bigger and more of a threat than Hamas is, and they have. They fundamentally have taken control of Lebanon, regardless of what the government looks like, regardless of what their parliament looks like. Hezbollah effectively is in control of the country, and they have been conducting terrorist attacks in northern Israel for quite some time. So the threat to Israel is that if Hezbollah actually launches a full-scale invasion, they're now going to have to fight at least on 2 fronts, one with Hamas in Gaza and then the other front being in northern Israel. It's also much more difficult terrain to fight in. Urban terrain is obviously very difficult, but it's a combination of urban and hill terrain in northern Israel. Some people have this vision of Israel that it's predominantly flat. That's not true unless you're in the Negev, and even then. But so it's difficult, and Iran is threatening to become directly involved. And so this represents a massive escalation, because if Iran is directly involved in the fight, that obviously represents a much bigger military, a much bigger budget, more sophisticated weaponry.
Don't you think that, one of the things we're seeing in the markets, as everything is spiraling downward, we see defense going up.
Yes.
Like Lockheed Martin is up, way up. So can you explain why those two things are linked, what the correlation is there?
Well, because generally speaking, the U.S. has a very interventionist foreign policy. And this is for two reasons. One form is direct intervention, when we actually send our military overseas, which is massively expensive because we have the most technologically advanced military in the world. There's a massive logistic train that goes with it. And when we're going through ordnance and things like that, that's expensive. One of the ways that we maintain the U.S. defense industry is we sell U.S. equipment to other militaries. So a lot of times when we provide foreign aid to, let's say, Ukraine or Israel, what a lot of that foreign aid looks like is the United States government buys a bunch of ordnance. Maybe it's artillery shells, maybe it's Side-1, maybe it's Patriot missile batteries, whatever it is, and then we export that to the countries that we're assisting through foreign aid. If there's going to be an expanded military engagement in the Middle East, then everybody is betting that the United States is going to be providing more military aid and assistance. But again, because it's not going in direct dollars, it's not like pallets of cash just show up in Israel or Ukraine. It's predominantly showing up in the form of U.S. military equipment and ordnance. So you pick the companies that actually develop the ordnance or the military weapons and equipment that you think are going to be shipped over there, and that's where you heavily invest. And it's not a bad bet. It's not a bad bet on a lot of those people. It's also one of the reasons why, like, again, as a combat veteran, as someone who wants to have a robust military and who wants to have a robust, it's not that I don't want U.S. companies to be developing military technology and equipment for the United States military. I do, but it's also important to understand that there can also be a very perverse incentive over there with respect to wanting, if you're benefiting economically through the use of ordnance and the use of military equipment, then it makes sense that you would be naturally inclined to say, oh yeah, U.S., you need to be involved in this over here.
Listen, about 10 years ago, I remember being in a conversation with you, maybe a little less than 10 years, but you mentioned you were in the Army for 11 years and then you got out. And you looked at me one time and said that if we ever go to war with Iran, you're getting back in. Mm-hmm. How do you feel about that now?
Under this administration, not very good. Under a Trump administration, I feel great about it.
Well, but then
because there's no nation building.
So don't tip me, baby.
But you're also about to be 45. How does that play in? I know, honey, you look amazing for 45.
Like, I've been working pretty hard to stay in shape, babe, but all right, thanks for calling me old. Jeez, Nate's over there laughing at me. Like,
now both of us have done it in today's podcast, right?
Well, no, here's the difference, and I've talked about this before. I am not an isolationist. I generally believe that the United States should not be getting directly involved in military conflicts for which there is no valid strategic interest for the United States. Now, does that mean I don't think we should have allies across the world? No, I think allies can be important, provided they're not constantly dragging us into conflicts for which we have no vested strategic interest. I do think that there's a valid strategic interest with respect to the Middle East, the Suez Canal region, all of that. I do think there's value in opposing terrorist organizations. Because let's face it, Hamas and Hezbollah and Iran, their ambitions are not limited to the Middle East. Like if you actually read what they write and what their overall objectives are. Now, we can look at that in the United States and you can have ambitions all day long. The real question is, what is your ability to actually carry out those ambitions? Because that determines what the nature of the threat is. There's no question that you hate us. There's no question that you would love to kill us and dominate us. You don't possess the capability to do so.
But you don't want to go over there and build a Western-style parliamentary democracy.
The biggest difference, and I remember, and by the way, I want to speak on this because Abigail Spanberger is running for governor of Virginia now, and I remember when Abigail Spanberger very arrogantly suggested that she was a part of the deal that freed up this money to go to Iran to keep them out of Iraq. Oh yeah, well I'm sure that sounded really good in an air-conditioned office in Quantico, Abigail. But for the guys that were actually getting shot by Iranian-backed militias, we didn't really appreciate an influx of cash to that regime. So thanks a lot, Abigail. Again, you were safe. Didn't impact you, right? Because, Little Miss Covert Operations wasn't actually doing that in any place that was actually dangerous at the time. Anyways, side note. But the biggest difference between the way that Trump handles America's enemies versus the way that George Bush handled them, or the way that Barack Obama handled them, or the way that,
Obama didn't handle any enemies.
No, he pretty much just gave money. Yeah,
some.
He created more. Trump understands the difference between a punitive expedition and a decades-long nation-building operation. And Trump was never really interested in conducting decades-long nation-building operations.
Trump's not a neoconservative.
No, Trump is like, if you pose a threat to us, I will neutralize the threat. That doesn't obligate me to come in, attempt to overthrow your government, and set up a parliamentary democracy. It is not on the American taxpayer, nor is it on the American service member to be responsible for recreating your nation in our image. That's not our job. We will neutralize the threat, though, and we will do it very effectively. One of the best things Trump did was when the Iranians were behind the embassy bombing in Iraq, in Baghdad. He didn't say, well, time to invade Iran and spend 20 years there. He said, who was responsible? And then he killed a member of the inner circle. That's what was so powerful, because it turns out a lot of these people don't want to be directly targeted. They don't care if you target their population. They don't care if you target their military and end up killing civilians. They'll be happy to then parade those civilians and say, look what the Americans did. But if you strategically take out one of them, all of a sudden they start paying attention. All of a sudden, turns out they're not quite so eager to die as they are to have their civilian population die for their cause. And it was one of the greatest things that I felt Trump did, is that he made sure that the people that were actually carrying out terrorist operations were the ones that paid for carrying out terrorist operations. Not civilian infrastructure, not targets where there was collateral damage. Nope, very, very specific. And that's the sort of administration I wouldn't mind going back to war, because I got some issues with Iran. But
I have something that, when you were answering a question earlier, I was spending like 5 minutes trying to dig this up, and I finally found it. So I want to read this off. It's not from me, believe it or not. It's actually from a book from and I mentioned her name earlier, Lynn Alden. I love her takes on stuff. In large part because she understands the problem of the fiat currency system and the long-term implications of it, not just the short-term implications. She has this paragraph in her book that came out last year that I'm still working my way through, but I think it really explains the nature of the problem on a macro scale, tying it into the whole free trade and why we can't build things in the U.S. anymore. She says this: the cost of the Eurodollar/petrodollar system from 1974 to the present is that by having so many entities around the world hold dollar-denominated assets for lack of a better alternative, it artificially increases the purchasing power of the US dollar. The extra monetary premium reduces the United States' export competitiveness and gradually hollows out the United States' industrial base. To supply the world with the dollars it needs, the United States runs a persistent trade deficit. The very power granted to the reserve currency issuer is also what, over the course of decades, begins to poison it and render it unfit to maintain its status. So what she's basically saying is the reason that the Rust Belt is now the Rust Belt, it used to be called the Steel Belt back in the 1940s and 50s, is because we're the world reserve currency. And we have not just the status of being the world reserve currency through the Bretton Woods system, which was abandoned after 1971, but the facade of the system is still in place, where the U.S. dollar, even though it's no longer supported by gold and silver, is still the reserve currency. We added to it with the petrodollar system, which parts of it have expired, but other elements of it are still in place. And so what this does is it basically increases artificially the demand for dollars. And so what has happened over time, if you remember the end of World War II, we were, I believe at one point, briefly, a majority of the world's GDP. In 1945, when, shocker, half the world was in ruins. But in 1945, the United States was an industrial superpower. We could produce effectively anything, and we could produce it here at home. Now, we weren't an autarky. There were things that we still imported. We did trade, but we had a very healthy industrial base. Detroit was like basically Silicon Valley. It was one of the richest parts of the United States. And look at the United States today. Do you remember the Baltimore Bridge collapse that took place in March? They're talking about how it will take 10 years to build a steel bridge over the Baltimore Bay.
Yeah.
We built the Empire State Building in like less than 2 years, and it's going to take us a decade to build a bridge.
Well,
the Romans Caesar could build a bridge in an afternoon, it's going to take us 10 years.
This goes back to the problem where, once again, once you make it if you make it more difficult to do something, you increase the cost and you increase the probability that the thing will not be done or it will take forever. And that's what we've done through regulation, rules, restrictions.
Yes. And the reason I'm bringing this up, this sounds like a tangent, but it has to be brought up. And the reason why is because there is a surge right now of economic populism in this country in both parties, particularly in our own Republican Party. Now, there's elements of this populism that I'm more open to. Like J.D. Vance is probably the most post-liberal vice presidential nominee of all time, but he's also embraced an idea that, well, it's, the fault of our current economic system that we can't produce anything and that the Rust Belt is the Rust Belt. No, it's the fault of the monetary system.
Yeah.
That we cannot produce anything. It's not the fault of the free market. It's the fault of the federal government's embracement of a certain monetary policy that has resulted in the hollowing out of our industrial base. So a lot of people look at what's happened in Michigan or Pennsylvania or Ohio and they say, we need tariffs to fix the problem. No, what we need is we need to abandon the current fiat monetary system that has hurt us, hurt middle America, hurt the heartland, hurt our industrial base, but it's enriched Silicon Valley and Wall Street. We used to have a free market entrepreneur. Calvin Coolidge once said the business of America is business.
Yeah.
When he said that in the 1920s, we made things in this country. We were an industrial superpower. We embraced a free market system where we were producing stuff and we were beating everybody in the rest of the world. We can't do that anymore, not because we can't beat them, but because we can't compete with them. And we can't compete with them not because we don't have high enough tariffs. We can't compete with them because we've screwed ourselves, because we've adopted a monetary policy that has made it easy for us to wage war abroad and difficult for us to export toasters abroad. That is the problem. Our number one export are dollars.
Yeah.
Not goods. And the reason that it's dollars and not goods, again, is not because we're not protectionist enough. The reason that we're exporting dollars is because we have rigged the system to benefit financial aspects of capitalism, the gaming of the system, the who gets the quantitative eased dollars first, right? We've embraced a monetary system where banks, we're investment firms, we're Warren Buffett, we're the Federal Reserve, we're Silicon Valley. Those who get access to the money first get to greatly benefit from it. But those who are further down the line are left aside. And what happens over time is you get an explosion of income inequality and you get a hollowing out of the American industrial base. It is a good thing that elements of the Republican Party are looking at this and being like, we need to do something to help the people of Michigan or Pennsylvania or Ohio. I'm totally on board with that. But until you understand that a huge reason why the Rust Belt is because of monetary policy, not because of fiscal policy or trade policy, we're not going to fix the problem.
I agree with you on that. I think one of the biggest concerns I have is that when people when people have this protectionist mindset, that the way that you protect the American economy, the way that you protect American industry is by high tariffs or high regulatory environments. It's like, no, you're not protecting the American people. You're not protecting the American economy. You're protecting those people that have the best political connections, because they're the ones that are going to get the subsidies. They're the ones that are going to get the regulations. In fact, one of the reasons why we're in the mess that we're in is because instead of remaining at peak competitive value with respect to our productive capacity, we decided to engage in left-wing economic policy, especially during the Great Society in the 1960s, where all of a sudden it was about like high-cost union deals, right? It was about, we're going to protect labor. Well, here's what you found out. If it was that simple, if it was really that simple, you can just pass a law and now you've protected it. Why didn't it work?
We did that with the Jones Act.
We did exactly with the Jones Act.
And it destroyed the American shipbuilding industry.
Why does Mongolia have more ships flying their flag than the United States when it comes to like deep sea tankers?
Well, it's because of their excellent ports.
Yeah, that's right. A landlocked country in Asia. No, it's like anybody that believes that the simple solution is just pass a law fundamentally misunderstands how economics operates. Right? You want an environment where more people are able to trade and exchange and compete and do business with one another. And by the way, there are certain industries within the United States that it doesn't make sense for the United States to still be doing.
Sure.
Right? It makes more sense in a high-tech economy for the United States to be at the cutting edge of manufacturing and production. What are we producing?
But we're not even leading in that,
No,
right? Semiconductors are made in Taiwan, not the U.S.
I get that. I'm not saying we're doing that. I'm saying that should be, again, when you have an economy that is as developed as the United States is, that is technologically advanced as the United States is, then to the extent that we're going to manufacture things, it's probably not going to be cheap T-shirts, right? It's going to be things theoretically like semiconductors. It's things that you need a complex economy in order to produce. You don't need a complex economy in order to produce cheap Nikes. You don't need that.
Sure, but I don't think that what I'm trying to do is I'm trying to speak to what is a growing but in some ways unaddressed movement on the right that is bringing up real problems, and I'm sympathizing with them, but I'm trying to make the argument, no pun intended, of what we need to do to address the problem, because I actually agree with J.D. Vance and some of these other people on the right that are saying we need to be able to make stuff in the United States. I think it's actually a security threat to us that it takes us 10 years to build a bridge in this country. We need to have a healthy steel industry that can actually build infrastructure in our country or build weaponry.
We can't is it's not just monetary policy, and it's also not just, I mean, Nick usually makes this argument that we've advanced beyond making this type of thing and now it gets made other places or what. But I would argue it's not necessarily that we've advanced beyond it. It's more that we've got so many hindrances to the marketplace. Labor is so expensive here due to regulation and laws on the books that force employers to pay out of pocket a lot more than people realize that they've got to pay per employee. And so employment in the U.S., the job market is too expensive to make this stuff here. So that's why we don't make it here. It's too expensive because of the laws. Now, if we didn't have all of these regulations, these laws on the books that hindered the marketplace in such a way, I don't think we have advanced so far beyond that we have to get our cheap Nikes from China. I don't think we've progressed so far that we can't make cheap T-shirts here. What it is it's our laws on the books. It's our when you labor is too expensive here.
Well, no, so the way I would put it is that when you have a regulatory environment, when you have a labor market, when you have a tax environment, all of which does two things simultaneously, which makes no sense, right? On one side, it makes it very, very difficult to start something, regardless of what the business is. It makes it hard to start something. It makes it hard to employ people. Because it's not as simple. It's not as simple as you going in going, hey, I would like to work for you, and this is how much I want to make. Okay, well, let's negotiate. I can provide this. Then the government comes in and goes, oh, and you have to provide this, and you have to provide this, and you have to provide this. Well, the laborer might not want that. They might well, I don't want them to provide that. I just want the extra cash, or I want this. Well, again, what's important to understand is that a lot of times I will see politicians go, well, what's the big deal? It's just a 1% thing, or it's just a piece of paperwork they have to fill out every year. No. If you are making them do it and they forget to do it, or they do it wrong, all of a sudden now they have fines, they have penalties, they can get sued, they can be shut down. And now everything what you should be focused on is how do I provide the best products and the best services, and how do I honor my commitments to both my customers and my employees, because I've got contracts essentially with both of them. But now when I have to dedicate all this time and attention to the government constantly coming up with new rules, new regulations, new restrictions, and I don't know what it's going to look like from one year to the next, here's my question. Do I invest in greater infrastructure? Do I invest in hiring more employees? Or am I trying to get rid of the liabilities associated?
You're trying to automate as much as possible.
I'm trying to get rid of it, right?
But that's what I was kind of bringing that up to say, I think that it's not necessarily that if it was a truly free market and we no longer made these things here because it's a free market and we've progressed past that, okay. But we don't have a free market. at this point. We've got a government suppressed market in a lot of ways. You know, the government really does put its boot on the neck of business owners, especially small business owners, and they bar entry to the market and everything else. And so I think that's more of a reason why we have this situation, and I don't think tariffs are going to fix it.
Well, again,
but it's not enough to just simply tell somebody, especially in a democracy. I mean, I complain about democracy all the time, but the fact is that we have elections, we have a democratic. Now people I know in the chat are going to be like, Christian, we're a republic, not a democracy. Go back and watch our debate between Nick and I that we had like a week or two ago, and I get your point, but point is that it's not enough to simply tell a block of voters that they're just wrong. Yeah. It is. You're totally right that tariffs are not going to fix the problem, but you have to offer a solution. You can't just simply say the solution that you're putting forward is wrong. Because when you do that, eventually they're going to be like, yeah, but what's your solution? And the point that I'm going to keep going back to is ultimately it all boils down to monetary policy. It's even more, I think monetary policy in some respects is even more important than the regulatory environment, than the tax environment, than even the fiscal environment. And the reason why is because when you have incredibly bad monetary policy, it makes it easy for you to get away, at least in the short term, with incredibly bad fiscal policy and incredibly bad regulatory policy. You extend the runway of what sort of reckless behavior you're allowed to get away with when you game the system at the start when it comes to money creation, which is ultimately what monetary policy is about. When you corrupt that is the foundation upon which complex societies are built when it comes to economics. Yeah. Similar to how morals and philosophy are the foundation upon which complex societies are built when it comes to the civic aspect of it, the social aspect of it, which we have we've talked about at length on this show. Well, on the economic side, the monetary policy is the foundation upon which complex economies grow out of. When that foundation is cracked, when that foundation is corrupted, the entire house of cards will one day come down upon itself.
Sure.
And we are slowly, but the thing is, people have this idea that it's going to be overnight. No. That we're going to be living in Mad Max overnight, or that it's going to be the end of the world. No, it's most a gradual erosion. Yeah. And the Rust Belt is a good example of this. It's been it was not overnight that every single plant in Michigan decided to close up shop. It was a 4-decade-long process to get to that point. And it's going to continue until you solve the root of the problem, which is that we have a corrupted monetary system that has enabled us to, again, export dollars and nothing else. You cannot project power when the only thing you're doing is exporting fiat currency. This is why we have a situation where we can't even build basic infrastructure in this country without a multi-billion-dollar price tag and a 10-year-long construction horizon in order to do so. That is bad, and it leads to big issues down the road.
So we're gonna sum this up because I want to move on to another topic here. But here's the bottom line. The inflationary monetary policy is the root of the evil of what's going on within our economy. It's inflationary monetary policy. Like all the other stuff are contributing factors. They're bad. You do not solve that by simply raising taxes on foreign goods, right? You do not solve that by simply saying we're going to regulate to give special advantages to certain businesses over other ones, right? So that's what you can't do. So what do you need to do? Like what should Trump Vance do if they win the election in November? Right off the bat, we need to move back to sound money. One of the best ways that you're going to do that initially is you have to fight against the federal bureaucracy, because the federal bureaucracy is doing two things right now that actually or doing things that hurt American business at the same time that encourages inflationary monetary policy. The way they encourage inflationary monetary policy is they constantly want to expand their programs and the scope of their responsibilities, which always requires more funding. So they're always trying to create more rent seekers, right? They're trying to create more constituents of the bureaucracy. Because if you're dependent on the bureaucracy for your money or welfare or subsidies for corporations or whatever it is, the bureaucracy gets more power as a result of that. The government then has to spend more money, and they're going to be enticed to engage in inflationary monetary policy. So go after the federal bureaucracy in order to help get back to sound money and reduce government spending, which fuels a lot of the inflation. Secondly, the unelected government bureaucracy, it's constantly making new rules and regulations. It's not as if all these rules and regulations, which are shutting down American industry, were voted on by Congress. The vast majority of them never were. Congress passed some all-reaching piece of legislation, and then the executive branch goes out there and promulgates regulation after regulation, fine after fine after fine, and every single time they do it, I don't care how nice you think it sounds. Every time you have a new rule, regulation, restriction, requirement, tax, anything, you have made it harder to do business. You may have a noble objective to that rule or regulation, but you have made it harder to do business, harder to build, harder to hire people. And every time you do that, you put American businesses at a competitive disadvantage with overseas economies. So don't do it. Don't punish American businesses. Don't do it. Allow free people to negotiate between the employee and the employer. This is what I'm willing to work for. This is the work I'm willing to do. If you take care of me, I'll stay here and I'll work. If you don't take care of me, I'll find somebody that does. That's how you actually encourage a good economy, a good, robust economy where both sides are being taken care of in the transaction. But the more you interject politicians and bureaucrats into that process, the more difficult it will become, the more expensive it will become, and the more businesses will look to either outsource and go overseas or automate and replace their labor force, because bad government policy has made employees a liability for companies. They have increased the liability associated with hiring people as opposed to building machines. Now, sometimes building machines make sense. Automation can make sense. But for all that is holy, don't make it more difficult and punish American businesses by making it hard for them to do business. So this is one of the reasons why, even though I don't agree with everything J.D. Vance says about the economy, even though I don't agree with everything Donald Trump says about the economy, right? I will fight those battles. I had somebody other like, you can't be a true free market economist if you support Trump's tariffs. I didn't say I supported Trump's tariffs, but I will say this. I support any administration right now that understands that the chief threat through inflationary monetary policy and everything else is the unelected federal bureaucracy, and I'm going to support the candidate that's going to go after that unelected federal bureaucracy. All right, let's move on to two other things that we're going to get to today, but we got to do it within like the next 30 minutes. The first one is Kamala Harris's VP choice. Did she make a good choice? I think she made an excellent choice.
I love her choice.
For me, I am super excited about her choice. Because, man, if I honestly think that Kamala Harris was thinking two things. Josh Shapiro would have been the best choice for her because he's a popular government in Pennsylvania, and the Democrats need to do good in Pennsylvania. And right now, they're hurting there.
Yeah, but she needed to court the anti-Semitic vote.
That's the problem, is that the base of the Democratic Party.
He even unjewed himself. He did. And he's getting slammed for it by fellow Jewish community members, but he basically came out and unjewed himself in order to try
What does that even mean?
He renounced everything he'd ever said.
Oh, yeah.
Yeah.
About Israel and about...
Right.
Well, Shapiro had some things that had opened himself up to criticism. Like there was like a sexual assault case within his office that he maybe tried to cover up.
That wasn't their biggest
That wasn't
beef.
their issue.
I'm just saying that there were things.
The paper that he wrote in college,
Yeah.
And the fact that he had volunteered
for the IDF.
Yes.
Yeah. That's imagine that. That's what killed him as the vice president. So he was by far the better choice for vice president if Kamala actually wants to win. And she couldn't do it because of elements within the Democratic base that would not accept a Jewish vice president that had, difficult things to say about Palestinians.
I also think that it wasn't just about Jews or Palestine. Like Shapiro was in some ways too moderate for the current Democratic Party.
That's true.
Like Shapiro pushed, he didn't get it through. He couldn't get it through his own party's controlled House, but Shapiro actually pushed school choice in Pennsylvania.
Yeah.
And he got it through the Senate because Republicans controlled it, and he almost got it through the House, but his own party sabotaged it. But he tried to get that passed as part of a grand compromise to increase education spending. So he's willing to make
I would have been a lot more concerned if Shapiro had been the nominee.
I would be too, because he would have carried Pennsylvania for Harris.
But this guy, what's his name again?
Tim Walz.
Like most of us are first time hearing about this guy. You know, if you're not from Minnesota, you don't care.
He's the governor of Minnesota.
He looks he has Bernie vibes big time. It's like Bernie was too old to pick. So she's like, who's the next best one who's most similar to Bernie and even has a little bit of Bernie flair in his look? It's him.
By the way, it's amazing because when you actually try to type things in to get information on this, Google has so manipulated their algorithm to make it nearly impossible to find negative information. Like it's
There's
never.
a lot of negative.
We did it last.
information
I was
out
on
there.
Tim Pool last night. We actually went on there, and Libby Evans was on as well. So she goes, "Here's my article." She goes, "We took the title of her article, put it in the Google search, didn't even show up in the top 10."
Yeah.
Didn't even show up in the top 10. Freaking Google, screw you, man.
Well, there have been, I do want to mention a whole group of retirees penned a truth about Tim Walz letter. And this is old. This is November of 2018. Okay. So this isn't brand new. And they're basically saying that when he was in the National Guard, he timed his retirement just perfectly so he didn't have to go to Iraq and everything and basically like abandon his troops. And that's what they're asserting. And there is a whole bunch of people that were under him who penned this letter. It was kind of like the Swift vote veterans back in the
with Kerry.
And
You know,
so you
it's
kind of
amazing.
have that going on now.
You type the exact same thing into Google and DuckDuckGo, and you will get drastically different results.
Oh yeah, we
said
know.
Tim Walz, stolen valor. You try to do that in Google, and nope, you're not going to get any of it. As soon as you do it in DuckDuckGo, first thing that comes up, fellow veteran speaks out on Walt's misleading statements. Waltz, Moriarty exchanged harsh criticisms of each other over whatever. But yeah, this is one of the things that a fellow veteran speaks out on Walt's misleading statements about military record. And this is what he said. He goes, as soon as the shots were fired in Iraq, he turned and ran the other way and hung his hat up and quit, said Tom Behrens, a retired command sergeant major who replaced Tim Walz on a deployment to Iraq. On a 150-year-old farm in Brewster, Tom Behrens hopes he tells it like it is style will finally get the attention he believes it deserves in Minnesota's governor's race. So this is a while back. The public needs to know how pathetic his leadership was as a National Guardsman, he said about Tim Walz. He's back again to wage a public war of words against Walz. This is what his grain bin looked like in the 2018 election. It says, Walz is a traitor, vote for Johnson. He goes, he abandoned us. What the hell kind of a leader does that? As soon as the shots were fired in Iraq, he turned around the other way and hung his hat up and quit. This all starts years ago when Behrens, sorry, that's his name. It's Behrends, says Walt's misleading statement about his military service first led him to come forward in the fall of 2018. The story was largely ignored, and Minnesota's largest newspaper, the Star Tribune, checked it out but decided not to publish. Go figure. When the reporter called, I thought, what the hell? Is this North Korea? Behrens recalled. Alpha News reached out to the Star Tribune but didn't receive a response. The backstory. Back in early 2005, a warning order went out to southern Minnesota's 1st Battalion, 125th Field Artillery to mobilize for a mission to Iraq. Waltz served as the unit's highest non-commissioned officer after he was conditionally promoted to Command Sergeant Major on April 1st, 2005, records show. On May 16th, Waltz retired from the Guard, avoided the deployment, and ran for Congress. Waltz has implied in previous statements that he didn't retire because of the deployment, but the National Guard records show his service obligation wasn't completed until September of 2007. Burns was next in line for the position and was asked to take his place. I was like, well, for Pete's sake, if this guy quits, if I say I'm not going to do it, I mean, what the hell kind of leadership is that? If a company would say we're going to deploy to Iraq and the foreman says I'm not going, what does that say to the 500 that work in that factory?
Can I just point out, I think this is an incredibly weak line of attack against him. This is going to get me some hate from some people, but I would not at all use this as the line of attack against this guy for a couple of reasons. One, Trump got draft deferments during the Vietnam War, so
Sure.
it just blows up in our face. Two, I do not think that the mood of the country right now is going to be holding against a guy that didn't want to go fight in the Iraq War.
Yeah.
So I just...
Well,
I'm just not interested in that as the line of attack, because I think that there are way, way better lines of attack against this guy than apparently that he didn't want to go and fight in the Iraq War.
Here's what I'm going to say. I agree with you. So let me just say that right off the bat. I don't think this should be the main line of attack. But I want to say two things. What veterans don't like is that if you're in the military, right, and you're going to talk about your time in the military, and when it came time for your unit to deploy and you were in a position of leadership in that unit and you manipulated or you worked the process to make sure you didn't have to go, that does factor in with us. That absolutely factors in with us, and it tells us something.
And they're the ones touting his former National Guard.
That's what it is.
They are bringing it up as a selling point.
Then we need to we need to tailor this message specifically to veteran voters to point that out to them.
Okay, so our VP pick is JD Vance.
Yeah.
Okay, her VP pick is him. And I understand that the stuff with Trump and, back in the day or whatever with draft deferments or what, but we're talking about two vice presidential candidates. They were trying to check off a military box in order to scoop in some low information military votes. And so we do have to address that. We don't need that to be our main line of attack, just like we don't need, Kamala's bare knees to be our main line of attack either. But history is history, right? And it all factors in, it all matters. And so, yeah, it may not be what we need to spend the most time on, but it's also history and it also matters.
Look, we've already established it's not the main line of attack that we should go with. The point that I'm trying to illustrate here. So you don't need to defend your statement. I'm just simply saying that as a veteran, as a combat veteran, if you're going to list your military credentials as one of the things that should cause me to be interested in you as a candidate, then I'm going to have some questions about what you did, what you served, why is it relevant to the position that you're talking about? And if you were in a position of leadership and then try to work your way out of a combat deployment, that says something to veterans. And so the proper thing to do would be maybe to not highlight that aspect of your career, if that's what you're going to go with. But let's move on. Let's move on to the real issues here.
I'll tell you one of the biggest issues. There's two of them. First off, this guy presided over the burning of Minneapolis during the rioting in 2020. So for the party of more democracy and the party of, combating extremism and stuff like that, this guy is responsible for scenes like this.
Yeah. Oh my, yeah, it looks like a war zone.
It does.
That's what Minnesota looked like. Talking about Iraq, right? This tweet says this isn't Iraq. This is Minnesota under Tim Walz as governor. This is the America if they win. Trump 2024 is the only way. That right there needs to be shown to every single swing voter in this country that this guy presided over the burning of American cities. It was in his state that this all started in the summer of 2020. Yeah. The George Floyd incident was in Minnesota. The first fires were lit in Minneapolis, and he did absolutely nothing to protect small businesses. He did nothing to protect police. He did nothing to protect firefighters. He did nothing to protect people's homes. He did nothing to protect the largest city in his own state that elected him.
Yeah.
Minneapolis is the reason he's governor, and he let that city be lit on fire day after day after day in the summer of 2020.
And the police bandwagon.
And he didn't even just allow it to happen. He threw his support behind the rioters that were setting fire to the biggest city in his state. That needs to be the first point. The second point is this guy is one of the people that's trying to tell us that Republicans are weird. And he's the one that's pushing transing your kid and drag queen story hour in Minnesota. It's under his watch that the state of Minnesota has been passing legislation to encourage transitioning children and mutilating them.
Well,
and he wants to lecture us about normality.
While Minneapolis was burning, he's on video talking about these people and what they're doing and what's motivating and what's behind it. And his closing statement was something to the effect of there's a sense of hope in what they're doing.
Yeah. Tim Walz signed a bill making Minnesota a trans refugee state. No age limits for minors could receive gender-affirming care. Governor Tim Walz signed a bill making Minnesota a legal refugee for kids seeking gender-affirming care. It prevents Minnesota from criminalizing hormone therapy and puberty blockers for children. He also came in, I love another one, and he said, what is it? Oh, one person's socialism is just another person's neighborliness. Since Minnesota Governor Tim Walz is officially being reported as a favorite to become the VP for Kamala Harris, here he is pictured from his DUI arrest where he was going 95 and a 55. He then lied to police about being deaf in an attempt to avoid his arrest.
What?
Yeah.
There's also, he signed a bill giving driver's license to illegal immigrants and or illegal aliens. I guess we should go back to that term.
Yeah.
But illegal immigration is a massive issue this election cycle because all of America is feeling it now.
Yeah.
And it's gotten so out of hand that nobody can deny it anymore. And so images of him signing something to allow illegal aliens to have driver's licenses issued to them in our country. And, oh, by the way, a driver's license is pretty much all you need in order to register to vote as well.
He also said back when Trump was president and pushing for the wall in his first term that he wanted to provide ladders to illegal aliens to climb over Trump's wall. So this guy has openly supported illegal, not more legal immigration, which is a whole nother problem. No. He wants more illegal immigration, and he's made it easier in his own state. He hasn't just said it. He's taken actions in his own state to make it easier for illegal immigrants to come into Minnesota and potentially even vote in elections in the state. This guy's pro-mutilating children. He's pro-rioting, and he's pro-mass illegal immigration at a time when we have 12 million illegal immigrants that came into this country in 3 years. And last time I checked, those three things aren't normal, and Republicans need to be calling him out on those things because those are the type of things that are going to cause swing voters in Pennsylvania, Michigan, and Wisconsin to say, no, we don't need this guy. This guy's a lunatic is what he is. He's an absolute radical. He's not a moderate. He's not a compromise builder. He's not a get-along-to-go-along Democrat. He's not your grandfather's Democrat. He's not a Bill Clinton Democrat or anything like that. This guy is a radical socialist who wants to reshape our country in the image of the BLM rioters while he's not busy trying to mutilate your children and indoctrinate them with Drag Queen Story Hour and import 12 million illegal immigrants into this country. Those are the three messages that we need to be telling voters between now and Election Day. Nothing else, because when we look at polling and when we look at what people are most concerned about, those are the type of things that are going to determine election. This guy's way too radical to be vice president of the United States. And if we know anything from the last administration that's currently leaving office, we know that many times the president isn't actually running the show. So if anything ever comes along and Kamala Harris doesn't have the competency to actually execute the office, guess who's next in line? It's going to be this guy, the guy that wants to take your children away from you while importing illegal immigrants into the country and cheering on rioters. We don't need him as the vice president. Everybody needs to know that message. And so I'm actually really happy that they've chosen this guy because I think that we can beat Kamala Harris with this as her vice presidential pick.
They picked him for two reasons. One, again, they felt Josh Shapiro was too moderate, and they've got a huge problem with anti-Semitism within large swaths of the Democratic base. And then the second reason they picked him is they thought, former National Guardsman, enlisted National Guardsman, non-commissioned officer, former football coach, teacher. This guy's going to appeal to middle-class workers within the Rust Belt, right? It's like, no. Once again, you fundamentally misunderstand what actually appeals to the sort of voters that you're trying to pretend that you care about. And again, they pick somebody who is truly radical on probably the definitive cultural issue right now, and certainly radical on the definitive border security issue right now. So, no, I think, does this impact the election? Yes, I think it helps Trump Vance significantly. Had she picked Shapiro, I'd have been a little bit nervous by that pick. I wasn't quite as black-pilled as I think you were on that one, but I definitely would have been a little bit concerned with that one. The last thing that we're going to talk about today, and we have saved the best for last, Jamie Raskin, congressman from Maryland, the party from the Party of Democracy, right? The Democratic Party.
You could tell by the way that they put Kamala Harris in the middle of the night.
Yeah. This guy essentially said he was doing an hour, I think it was like an hour-long interview as part of a panel at a bookstore on a new book that was coming out, and he was talking about all the problems with certain justices within the Supreme Court and largely the conservative justices, and he was talking about how what this is all going to boil down to is that because the Supreme Court did not disqualify Donald Trump based off of the 14th Amendment to the Constitution, because in his words, they threw it back to Congress. He goes, fine, then it's going to be on us this is what he said. It's going to be on us on January 6th, 2025 to tell the Trump mobs that he's been disqualified. He goes, we're all going to need bodyguards, or we're going to need to go into like Civil War policies to ensure
a Civil War footing
to ensure that Donald Trump cannot take office. This is the part where...
Do we have the actual quote?
This is very dangerous for our democracy.
Very dangerous. So go to there's a, hey, Christian, there's a second link there, the second link under part 6 on the show notes.
Sure.
Bring that one up. That has the It's all the way at like 101. Is it already there?
Give me 1 second and I will pull it up.
All right, move it to, it's like 101 and 4 seconds is the timeline, and I'll bring it up. But yeah, hear it directly from him. Don't take my word for it.
Is it an hour
Go
okay.
all the way in. 1 hour and 1 minute. Go to 1 hour and 1 minute. Oh yeah, it does need audio. Okay. All right. Well, we'll just The bottom line is
I could just pull up the transcript.
Yeah. What he actually ended up saying, and you see this in the report they did on the Federalist about it. But yeah, what I just said is what he said. He said that he goes, it's going to be up to Congress. So it's going to be up to us on January 6, 2025 to tell the rampaging Trump mobs that he's disqualified. And I want you to think about that for a second. That assumes some things, right? The way he said that assumed that Donald Trump wins. Right? Donald Trump wins the election, and now he's going to come in and say, well, we're going to have to tell the rampaging Trump mobs that he's disqualified. Not our fellow Americans, right? Not people that we disagree with on policy. No, those rampaging Trump mobs.
I think I can play it.
And go ahead.
The 14th Amendment, which they're just disappearing with the magic wand, as if it doesn't exist.
It's playing from my laptop.
Okay, so the point is that think about this. Like for all the crap that Republicans take off the mainstream media for being divisive and intolerant and everything else, and this actually happened 5 months ago. I think it's only now like finally getting attention. To say something like that, to where. No, our job in Congress is going to be to tell you rampaging moms that your candidate is disqualified, and we're going to make sure we got plenty of people there with guns to not only provide protection for us, but ostensibly to go after you as well.
I'm going to try it one more time.
No. Just.
You sure?
We already said it twice now. We don't need it. I mean, if people want to go and see it, you can go. Politics and Prose is the YouTube channel, and it says Rick Hansen, a real right to vote with Representative James Raskin and Sherilyn Ifill. But yeah, he said this like 5 months ago, and it just went kind of viral yesterday as people came across this quote at the very end of this statement, because it's fairly radical. But this is where we're at. This is kind of why I go back to this idea.
Do I sound crazy now when I keep saying that we're moving towards
Well, here's what I'd like to point out. This is the sort of guy that doesn't want to secure the southern border. This is the sort of guy that didn't care if Minneapolis was burning or Seattle was burning or Portland was burning or that Chaz and Chops were being set up. He didn't care. That was all part of dealing with the pandemic of institutional racism. Right? Did not care. Did not care if he was shutting down your church or your business, but if you wanted to go out and riot during COVID, well, that's fine because we have a global pandemic with respect to institutional racism. But when it comes to him wanting to disqualify a major party's political choice, someone that theoretically would be duly elected, then all of a sudden, what does he want? He wants guns, he wants troops, he wants cops, he wants walls, he wants barriers, he wants all of it. Not to protect the United States from what's going on the southern border. No. To protect himself from you.
He's declared us the enemy is what he's done.
We're the enemy. And this is the part where we talk about this a lot, where for the longest time, William F. Buckley Jr. used to talk about this. We think they're wrong. They think we're evil. And I've gotten to the point where I'm tired of me treating people that I disagree with as, well, look, we're all Americans, or in the legislature, we're all Virginians. We just disagree on how to get to certain things, or we're going to have civil discourse in order to determine. And then them treating me like an enemy. And I'm at a point right now where it's like, okay, let me make something very, very clear. I don't want to be your enemy. I don't. But
you don't get to choose.
But if you are the party that is going to say that you get to do this to children, if you're the party that's going to say that if you don't like the election result, you're going to treat me like a mob, and you're going to bring in law enforcement or the military or whatever else in order to disqualify the election result you don't like, well, then you know what? You were right and I was wrong. I am your enemy. I am your enemy. And if you would like me to start behaving as such, well, that's entirely up to you. But like you said, we used to, this is a saying in the military, the enemy gets a say in everything that you do. And I don't like to think of my fellow countrymen as my enemies, but if they're going to treat me like enemies, if they're going to go ahead and resort to this sort of tactics in order to prevent election outcomes they don't like, then I really don't care about them protesting threats to democracy, because that dude is the threat to democratic processes. That dude is a threat. And he doesn't get to sit around and turn and look at me like I'm the bad guy. But yet, That's
like I
where
said,
we're at.
You might not want to say they're the enemy, but unfortunately, and they, you know, they're not yours, but unfortunately we don't get a say in that. They have declared us to be the enemy. They are applying the friend-enemy distinction, and for so long we have not. We've resisted doing that because we know where that leads.
Yeah.
But at some point we have to wake up and realize there is no compromise and coexistence with people that have declared you the enemy. There's only defeating them. And when you see rhetoric like that, and not just rhetoric, you have to understand actions. They've tried to disqualify our presidential nominee. They've tried to throw him in prison. He almost was assassinated.
They changed the law in New York State in order to adjust the statute of limitations so they could take him to jail. And the very legislator that changed that statute of limitations then tried to say it was unconstitutional when somebody brought up, I think, sexual assault charges against him. Like the lawfare, everything else. This is the part where it has come to a point where, again, we had this discussion on a previous podcast. It really is getting to a point where, again, Tim Pool said this in a way that I really appreciated. And he said, look, he goes, my policy used to be I will defend, I'll defend your right to free speech no matter what. He goes, now my policy is I will defend your right to free speech provided that you actually defend the right to free speech. But if you're going to utilize free speech in order to condemn it, if you're going to utilize free speech in order to come after your enemies and then attempt to change things and manipulate things in such a way to where you have the benefit of free speech, but the people that you disagree with do not, he goes, I'm not going to defend you. I'm not going to defend that because you do not want to afford the same basic privileges and civil liberties to other people that you then want to use as a tool for your political opposition's destruction. And it is absurd. It is intellectually ridiculous for somebody to say, no, I'm going to fight to the death for your ability to then use the very rights you want to diminish in order to come after me. That doesn't make any sense. And unfortunately, that's the realm that we are quickly entering. At
some point, and I don't know how we're going to do it, but at some point we're going to need to discuss in more depth the friend-enemy distinction. I just need to figure out how to articulate it because it's a real thing. And for a long time, the left have been applying it, and we haven't. And that's a huge reason why conservatives haven't conserved anything in this country other than arguably gun rights, maybe. And part of the reason why is because we have not been applying the same type of, when I say standard, I don't mean just let's act like the left. I mean more like we have not been applying the same friend-enemy distinction to the left the way that they have. We have foolishly believed that, well, we're all just fellow Americans and we can just disagree on policy. Sure, you can disagree on policy, but you cannot disagree on philosophy and you cannot disagree on morality. And when the existential debate is not over what the top marginal tax rate is or what you're going to do to fix the roads or anything like that, when the existential debate is whether or not child mutilation should be allowed or whether or not we should allow for 12 million illegal immigrants to come into the country and then run vice presidential candidates that apparently want to give them the right to vote in American elections, when that is the debate, that is not a policy debate at that point. That is an existential philosophical divide that cannot be settled through simple parliamentary debate and discussion. So that's where we're at right now. It's disappointing, but the good news is the Democrats have apparently shot themselves in the foot. So Nick, wrap us up here. Explain.
Yeah, it's kind of funny that Tampon Tim is the #1 trending hashtag on X right now because apparently, thanks to Tim Waltz, there are tampons in the men's restrooms now all over Minnesota.
Oh, well, thank goodness.
Due to his hard work.
Well,
so
thank
hashtag Tampon Tim is now going into a lot of tweets.
Well, thank God we handled that existential crisis that America was facing. All right, look, here's the deal. I am still every bit as committed to the underlying philosophies that I always have been, right? But what is changes in the nature of the fight, which changing is the nature of what exactly is at stake. And here's what I will go back to and I will always remain committed to, and that is the idea that anybody that is willing to have an honest conversation, and by an honest conversation, what I mean is that there's certain objective standards by which our statements, our positions, our data can be analyzed and judged against reality. That's why when I find somebody who disagrees with me, but also values the laws of logic or values an underlying belief in the thing that there's such a thing as objective truth, that's someone I can have a very interesting discussion with. And even if we disagree, at the end of the day, at least I know more about their perspective, and hopefully they know and understand more about mine. But I can't have that conversation with somebody who not only disagrees with me, but will immediately jettison logic, reason, rationality, the moment they start to lose the debate as some sort of tool of the patriarchy or, indication of white supremacy. That I can't have a discussion with, and that you cannot peacefully coexist with. And unfortunately, we're increasingly see this more and more within a major political party within this country. Now, one thing I want to be very clear about, and we've articulated this several times, I have no desire to replace left-wing authoritarianism with right-wing authoritarianism. But by the same token, the right better become a lot more comfortable with the ability of using the power once it has been justly granted to them by the people in order to dismantle some of these institutions and organizations which have now been weaponized against us. If we put Trump and Vance in there and we give them a Congress that is willing to work with them, they have to go about dismantling certain elements within the unelected executive branch in order to actually preserve the things which make this country unique and special among the world. And that's the part that we also have to understand, right? Is that I expect institutions, I expect the law to be neutral in the sense that the law should be applied equally to all citizens, regardless of their political positions, regardless of their religion, regardless of any number of factors. But our institutions themselves cannot be neutral when it comes to the preservation of the ideas and values which made those institutions relevant in the first place, possible in the first place. And unfortunately, we have people now that they don't mind using democratic processes insofar as it yields the results that they want, but the moment they do, they're willing to throw them out. They're willing to utilize free speech insofar as it gives them a platform to speak, but then when they actually have control over a particular platform, their objective is to silence your ability to speak. This is the sort of problem that we have within certain American institutions right now, where we need to understand something. We cannot be neutral toward everything. If you don't actually believe in individual liberty, personal responsibility, private property rights, these are core fundamental principles of what makes the United States possible. And if your goal, if your ultimate political objective is to upend that and to replace it with something that bears no resemblance to what the United States was actually founded on, then I would suggest that's problematic. That's not the typical debate that we've had in the past on should the marginal tax rate be 1% or 2% or whatever. No, this is an entirely different argument. And these two worldviews are so diametrically opposed that one has to win. The reason why they cannot peacefully coexist with one another is because one side of the debate will not allow it to be. So, anyways, I know we got a little bit off topic from what we were originally talking about, which was the whole idea of what has been happening with the stock market, what has been happening with potential conflicts and wars within the Middle East, what's going on with vice presidential ticks. But if I could offer this as a reason why these things are all connected, is because this election year I really feel is different than previous election years. I really think that the contrast that we're starting to see take place and the results and how that plays out into international conflict, how that plays out into economic development, how that plays out into trade, how that plays out into what sort of country we want to be, all of that is on the ballot this year in a way that it hasn't been in the past. And so we are, unfortunately, in a point where we're going to have to start picking sides in a far more definitive way than we might have been comfortable with in the past. Because as I look at what Harris wants to achieve, as I look at the sort of country that Waltz envisions for the future, it bears no resemblance to the country that I love, the country that I fought for, the country that I've raised my family in. And so I'm going to take very seriously the fight in order to preserve those things. Because the United States doesn't just exist in some sort of vacuum where any sort of political philosophy can be at the foundation of it and you get the same results. And there's certain things that, quite frankly, we cannot view with neutrality. There are certain things that we have to oppose as a country and a people. Otherwise, we will lose the very identity of what it's always meant to be an American. So, anyways, hope you found this episode interesting. Thank you very much for watching, for your your comments. We always appreciate that. Always appreciate the feedback. Please check out Circle as well. That's our online community. If you would like to learn more, if you'd like to have more influence on the sort of topics that we discuss, that's a great place to start. Also, please, once again, remember Good Ranchers, right? They have a great deal. You use promo code Nick. You can go to the link in the description. Use promo code Nick. You're going to get $25 off plus free express shipping with your order, along with all the other deals that they're doing. Support Good Ranchers, not just because they provide a really good product and service, but because they're a good company, and because when you support them, you also end up supporting this show. So once again, thank you very much for joining us, and we will see you next episode.